The morning broke without mercy over Asheville, North Carolina. The mountains were hidden behind sheets of white, and the streets were hushed as if the world itself were holding its breath. Inside the Ellison estate at the edge of town, the faint hum of the heater filled the silence. Graham Ellison sat at his kitchen counter, a cup of black coffee untouched beside him. The man had built a textile empire from the ground up, yet he still carried the same empty look every winter, like someone who'd been waiting for a sound that never came. He slipped on his long wool coat and checked his watch. 7:30. The driver would be outside, tires already crunching on frozen gravel. He moved through the quiet house, his footsteps echoing softly against marble floors. There were no family photographs on the walls, no laughter from a living room. The only color came from a single painting, a winter landscape pale and endless. He stopped before it for just a second, then turned away. When he stepped outside, the wind cut like glass, the kind of cold that reached the bones no matter the fabric or the price. His driver, a middle-aged man named Reggie, tipped his hat. "Morning, sir. Roads are slick today." Graham nodded. "Then let's not waste time." His voice, even calm, carried the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. But before Reggie could open the car door, a shape appeared near the gate, small, slow-moving, and strangely out of place against the white. At first, Graham thought it was an animal. Then the shape stumbled. A child. He frowned, stepping closer. What on earth? The wind blew harder, sweeping snow in spirals. A little girl, no older than 6, was trudging through the drift. Her red coat was faded, her boots soaked, and the ends of her brown ponytail were stiff with frost. Her face was pale, eyes glassy. She was still trying to walk, clutching a worn backpack to her chest. "Hey, Graham," shouted his voice, cutting through the storm. The girl looked up, dazed. For a heartbeat, she seemed relieved, then her knees buckled. Graham's coffee slipped from his hand and hit the snow with a dull thud. He ran, the cold, forgotten coat flaring behind him. The child collapsed just as he reached her, so light he caught her in one arm. Her skin was like ice. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, the word surprising even himself. "Can you hear me?" Her lips trembled, barely parting. "Sir, my mom didn't come home last night." The words were fragile, fading into the wind. He swallowed, heart knocking hard against his ribs. "All right, you're safe now." Without thinking, he scooped her up and carried her toward the house, shouting over his shoulder, "Reggie, call the doctor and tell Mrs. Ames to get blankets ready." Inside, the grand foyer filled with hurried footsteps. The staff, usually precise and silent, moved quickly for once. Graham knelt near the fireplace, laying the girl on a velvet sofa. The contrast between her fragile frame and the rich surroundings was almost painful. Her coat slipped open, revealing a thin cotton dress damp from melted snow. He wrapped her in his own overcoat and turned up the heat on the hearth until flames flared orange and alive. Mrs. Ames, the housekeeper, brought towels and murmured, "Poor thing. She must have been out there for hours." Graham barely heard her. His attention stayed fixed on the little girl's pale face. "What's her name?" "No idea, sir. Nothing in her pockets." Mrs. Ames replied softly. Graham noticed the small backpack had fallen beside the couch. He opened it carefully. Inside were torn gloves, a lunchbox with a few crumbs, and a folded sheet of paper. When he unfolded it, he saw a drawing done in crayons. A woman with blonde hair holding hands with a little girl under a big yellow sun. At the bottom, in shaky letters, was a name written twice, Lila and Mommy. He stared at it for a long moment. Then his voice came out lower, almost to himself. "Where is your mother, little one? And what brought you here?" Behind him, the wind howled against the tall windows as if demanding an answer he didn't have yet. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with a faint scent of cedar. The girl's small body began to shiver under the warmth, a sign that life was returning. Graham leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, watching her face. Her lashes trembled as if she were halfway between dream and waking. For a moment, he saw a glimpse of something in her expression, a trust so pure it almost hurt. Her lips moved again. "Mommy always comes home," she whispered, barely audible. Then her head tilted slightly toward the sound of the fire. Graham exhaled slowly, the words staying with him longer than he expected. The doctor arrived within minutes, a local man with kind eyes and a snow-dusted coat. He examined the girl, quickly checking her pulse, her temperature, her breathing. "Mild hypothermia," he said, adjusting his glasses. "She's lucky you found her when you did." Graham nodded, arms folded, still standing near the hearth. Will she be all right? With rest and warmth, yes. She's strong, this one. The doctor smiled gently before leaving instructions with Mrs. Ames about soup and rest. As the front door closed behind him, silence settled again, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Graham stayed seated near the couch. He could have gone to his office hours ago. There were contracts waiting, investors calling, but none of that felt urgent now. Something about this child's arrival had cracked open the quiet armor he'd built for years. When Lila stirred again, she blinked at the flames dancing nearby, confusion shadowing her eyes. Then she saw him. You're the man from the gate. Graham's voice softened, unfamiliar to his own ears. Yes, and you're the brave one who walked all the way here in the snow. Her brow furrowed. I didn't mean to. Mommy said, if I'm ever scared, find a kind adult or the big house on the hill. The man there is nice. He froze. She said that Lila nodded earnestly, but I didn't think you'd really open the gate. He glanced toward the tall iron doors visible through the window, still half buried in white. The big house on the hill. He felt a pull in his chest, a strange guilty recognition. How many winters had he watched those same gates close behind him, shutting out a world he no longer cared to understand? He took a deep breath. What's your name, sweetheart? Lila, she said softly. Lila Collins. The name struck him like a quiet chord he couldn't place. He repeated it under his breath, the syllables unfamiliar yet hauntingly near. He looked down at the crayon drawing again, the blonde woman holding hands with the little girl under the yellow sun. Mrs. Ames appeared at the doorway, a steaming cup in her hand. Hot cocoa for her, sir. Lila sat up slightly, clutching the blanket. Graham nodded. Thank you. When the housekeeper left, he watched the child take a careful sip, her small fingers trembling around the cup. For reasons he couldn't explain, Graham found himself lowering his voice as if speaking to something fragile. Do you remember where your mother works, Lila? She looked uncertain. At the big place with machines. She goes when it's dark. It's loud there. He felt a slow tightening in his stomach. There were many factories around Asheville, but only a few that ran overnight, and all of them belonged to him. Outside, snow began to fall harder, tapping against the windows like 1,000 quiet knocks. The fire glowed brighter, its warmth pushing against the cold that crept along the glass. Graham sat back, the weight of the drawing still in his hand, the name echoing in his mind. Lila Collins. The clock struck 9. Somewhere deep inside the house, the heating system groaned. He stood, walked to the window, and stared at the world swallowed in white. He'd spent years measuring success by balance sheets and board votes, yet in this single morning, a little girl had undone all his calculations. Behind him, Lila's soft breathing evened out. She'd fallen asleep again, safe and warm, her small backpack lying beside the couch. Graham looked down at her one last time before turning toward the dim corridor. His reflection in the glass looked older than it had that morning. As the snow beat harder against the windows, Graham realizes the name Collins sounds oddly familiar, but he can't yet place it. The snow had softened by morning, but the sky still hung low and gray over Asheville. Inside the Ellison estate, the fire had gone down to embers. Graham stood by the window with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He hadn't slept much. The little girl Lila Collins was still asleep in the guest room, curled beneath blankets that seemed too large for her small frame. Every few hours, Mrs. Ames checked in, adjusting the heater, whispering something kind before closing the door again. Graham's phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from thought. His assistant, Sophie Landon, had already sent 3 messages before sunrise. Meeting at 9. Investors waiting. Where are you? He sighed. For years, Sophie had been the closest thing to a conscience, his business life allowed, organized, sharp, and quietly loyal. He picked up the phone and typed back, running late. I need you to clear my schedule until noon. When he arrived at headquarters, the building stood out against the dull sky like a shard of glass, sleek, modern, efficient, everything he thought life should be. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and polished steel. Employees greeted him with cautious smiles, though no one dared small talk. He moved through them quickly, each step echoing in the marble hall. Sophie met him outside his office. Morning, sir. Are you all right? You look well, not your usual self. Graham loosened his scarf. I had an unexpected visitor last night. Oh. Sophie raised an eyebrow. half curious, half worried. "A child," he said simply. "She turned up at my gate in the middle of the storm." For once, Sophie had no quick reply. She followed him into his office, closing the door behind her. "Is she—" "All right, she will be," he said, setting his briefcase aside. "But her mother didn't come home. I need to find her." Sophie blinked. "Find her, personally, yes." Graham sat down, already powering on his computer. "Her name is Mara Collins. The girl called her Mommy and said she works somewhere with big machines and night shifts." Sophie's expression shifted from surprise to understanding. "You think she works for one of your factories?" He nodded slowly. "That's what I intend to find out." Within minutes, she had HR on speakerphone. The calm voice of the director came through the line, formal and cautious. "Good morning, Mr. Ellison. How can I assist?" "I need information on an employee named Mara Collins," Graham said. "Possibly at the Riverbend or Holden facilities. Check last night's shift logs." "Of course, sir. Please hold." The line went silent except for faint keyboard clicks. Graham looked out the window, watching sleet streak the glass. Across the street, a man was spreading salt on the sidewalk. Every movement looked slow, deliberate, human. He thought of the drawing folded in his pocket crayon. Sunstick figures the word Mommy. He had almost forgotten what innocence looked like. "Sir." The voice came back through the speaker. "We found her in the system. Mara Collins, age 29, night shift seamstress at Riverbend. She clocked in yesterday evening at 6, but never clocked out." Sophie's eyes met his. "No report of absence." "None, ma'am," said the HR voice. "We assume she left quietly or took a later bus. Should we flag it?" Graham's jaw tightened. "You should have already." He cut the call short before his temper could edge further. For years he had prided himself on control systems, numbers, efficiency, but now those same systems had failed a woman who trusted them to pay her rent and feed her child. Lila's small voice echoed in his mind. "Mommy always comes home." He rose abruptly. "Sophie, have the car ready. We're going to Riverbend. Now." "Yes, and bring a blanket, some snacks. She's coming with us." Sophie hesitated only a moment. "You're bringing the girl." Graham looked at her, the decision already made. "She started this search. I won't leave her behind." Outside, the city was still half asleep, streets lined with slush and gray ice. The black SUV idled near the entrance, heater humming. As Graham approached, he caught a glimpse of a small face pressed to the back window. Lila, wrapped in a new coat Mrs. Ames had found, held a cup of hot cocoa with both hands. When she saw him, her smile was faint but certain, as if she already knew he would come. He opened the door carefully, nodding to her. "Morning, Lila. Morning, Mr. Warmcoat," she said, with the unshakable honesty of a child. The nickname made Sophie glance up in surprise. Graham almost smiled. "Seatbelt on, please. We've got somewhere important to be." The car rolled out of the driveway, tires crunching over ice. Behind them, the mansion shrank into a pale blur. Ahead, the industrial edge of Asheville waited factories, standing like gray towers against the mountains, smoke rising thin into the morning sky. The snow had stopped, but the cold remained quiet and watchful. Graham sat back, the hum of the engine steady beneath them. For the first time in years, he wasn't heading toward profit or power, but something far more human, and he wasn't entirely sure he was ready for it. The drive out of town was slow. Frost still clung to the tree branches that lined the road, bending them like silver arches. The SUV's heater hummed softly, filling the silence between them with a gentle warmth. Lila sat in the back, wrapped in a thick blanket that nearly swallowed her whole. She watched the passing landscape with wide eyes, the shops with their closed for weather signs, the white hills, the faraway shapes of barns dusted in snow. Sophie checked her notes on a tablet. "The Riverbend facility's been running non-stop since Thanksgiving," she said quietly. "Overtime's high. Some of these workers have been pulling 12-hour shifts." Graham's hands tightened around the steering wheel. "That changes today." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There was something about the way he said it that made Sophie glance at him with a faint respect she hadn't felt in years. In the rearview mirror, Graham saw Lila staring at the horizon. She wasn't fidgeting or speaking, just watching, serious in a way that didn't belong to children. He turned slightly. "You doing all right back there, sweetheart?" She looked up, eyes bright but steady. "I'm okay. The cocoa's warm. That's good." He hesitated. "We'll find her. Your mom." Lila nodded, almost as if she believed it more than he did. The car curved along a narrow stretch of highway where the land opened up into a valley. The smokestacks of Riverbend rose in the distance, tall, gray, and silent under the fading clouds. A line of box trucks stood idling outside the loading docks. The air carried a faint metallic tang, the smell of oil and fabric dust. When they arrived, a security guard stepped forward, startled at the sight of the CEO stepping out of his own vehicle. "Mr. Ellison, sir." "We weren't expecting. I'm sure you weren't." Graham cut in gently but firmly. "Where's the shift supervisor?" The man pointed toward a smaller building attached to the main plant. "Inside, sir. Break room hallway." As they walked, Lila clutched Sophie's hand, her boots leaving tiny prints in the slush. Workers passing by stopped mid-stride, whispering to each other. It wasn't every day the head of Ellison Textiles appeared unannounced, and certainly not with a child in tow. Graham pushed open the door to the break room. The hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic pounding of machines filled the background. The supervisor, a balding man with nervous eyes, nearly dropped his clipboard. "Mr. Ellison, this is a surprise. I need to see your shift logs from last night," Graham said, "specifically for a seamstress named Mara Collins." The man hesitated. She didn't clock out, sir. We thought maybe she left through the side gate. Did anyone check?" A pause. "Not exactly, sir. We were short-staffed." The air in the room grew heavy. Graham's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. He took a slow step forward. "Show me the rest area." The supervisor swallowed. "It's just down the hall, but now." Lila's small voice broke through the tension. "Is Mommy here?" she asked softly, looking up at the man. He blinked, unsure how to answer, and turned helplessly toward Graham. They moved together through the narrow corridor, the sound of machines fading as they entered a quieter wing. The rest area was dim, barely more than a storage room with a single bench and a row of lockers. A vending machine flickered weakly in the corner. Lila's steps slowed. Something in the air made her stop. Her eyes scanned the floor, the benches, the shadows, and then she gasped. Her tiny hand slipped free of Sophie's, and before anyone could react, she ran forward. Mommy Graham froze. His heart clenched as he saw a woman lying on the floor near the lockers, one arm tucked under her head, her skin pale as paper. "Mara Collins," he whispered. He dropped to his knees beside her. Her skin was hot to the touch, damp with sweat. Her breaths came shallow, uneven. "She's burning up." He said more to himself than anyone. "Call an ambulance." Sophie already had her phone out, barking quick instructions. Lila knelt beside her mother, tears welling in her eyes. "Mommy, wake up! Please wake up!" Mara stirred faintly, lips trembling. Her eyes fluttered open for a split second, unfocused. Graham bent closer. "You're safe now. We're getting you help." Her lips moved soundlessly, maybe trying to say her daughter's name. Then she went still again. Without thinking, Graham lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, too light. "Forget the ambulance," he said firmly. "We'll get her there faster." As he carried her out of the factory, the workers stepped aside, their whispers following him down the hall. No one had noticed the woman missing until now. No one had looked. The cold air hit his face as they reached the car. Snow had started again, faint and steady. He laid Mara gently across the back seat, Lila crawling in beside her, holding her mother's hand. Sophie climbed into the front, giving directions to the hospital. Graham gripped the wheel. "Hang on," he said, voice rough. "We're almost there." In the rearview mirror, he saw Lila pressing her forehead to her mother's arm, whispering through tears, "It's okay, Mommy. Mr. Warmcoat found you." The words made him tighten his grip until his knuckles turned white. He pressed the gas harder, the SUV surging forward through the falling snow. The factories faded behind them, gray silhouettes swallowed by the storm. For the first time in years, Graham wasn't driving toward a meeting or a deal. He was driving toward something that actually mattered. As the SUV sped through the storm, the snow began to thicken again, and Graham glanced in the mirror at the two figures huddled together, mother and child, realizing he would never be the same man once this night was over. The drive to the hospital was a blur of gray and white. Snow whipped against the windshield, and the wipers struggled to keep up. Inside the car, time seemed suspended between each breath. Mara lay across the back seat, her head resting on Lila's lap. The little girl's small hands trembled as she stroked her mother's hair, whispering the same words over and over. "It's okay, Mommy. We're almost there." Graham's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He had driven through worse storms before, but this one felt personal, like the world itself was demanding he stay awake, stay human. Beside him, Sophie kept calling ahead, giving updates to the emergency room. Unconscious high fever, possibly pneumonia, ETA 10 minutes. The tires skidded slightly at a turn, but Graham steadied the wheel without slowing down. When they reached the hospital, nurses were already waiting by the entrance. The moment he stopped the car, the doors flew open and the cold rushed in. "We've got her!" one of them shouted, lifting Mara onto a stretcher. Lila tried to follow, but a nurse gently held her back. "Let us help your mama first, sweetheart." She nodded, silent tears streaking her cheeks. Graham stepped forward. "She stays with me," he said quietly. And though the nurse hesitated, something in his tone left no room for argument. They moved down long hallways that smelled of antiseptic and coffee. The hospital lights were too bright after the gray world outside. In the waiting area, Graham sat with Lila curled up beside him. She was too small for the chair, her legs dangling, blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. Every few minutes she asked, "Will they fix her?" And each time he said the same thing. "Yes, they will," even though he didn't know for sure. Sophie stood nearby, speaking softly with the attending nurse, then returned with 2 paper cups of cocoa. "She's stable for now," she said. "They're running tests, but the doctor thinks exhaustion and infection. She hasn't eaten properly in days." Graham looked through the small window in the door at Mara's motionless figure on the hospital bed. "How long would she have lasted if we hadn't found her?" he asked. Sophie didn't answer right away. Not long. He nodded slowly, jaw tight, eyes dark with something more than guilt. Hours passed in uneven silence. The snow outside slowed to a drift, the world dimming into evening. Lila had fallen asleep again, her head resting against his arm. He didn't move. Somewhere between the rhythmic beep of hospital monitors and the hum of heating vents, a strange calm filled the room. It wasn't peace exactly, it was recognition. The kind a man feels when life quietly reminds him that money can't buy what truly matters. When the doctor returned, she spoke in a measured tone. "She'll need rest fluids and antibiotics, but she'll recover. You got her here in time." Graham exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Can I see her briefly?" the doctor said. "She's still weak." Inside the room, the lights were softer. Mara's face had regained a trace of color, though her breathing remained shallow. Lila stirred awake as Graham lifted her gently and carried her to the bedside. The little girl's voice was a whisper. "Hi, Mommy." Mara's eyes opened slowly, heavy but aware. The first thing she did was reach out, fingers brushing her daughter's cheek. "Baby?" she murmured, her voice cracked but warm. "You found me." Lila nodded through tears. "Mr. Warmcoat did. He brought you here." Mara turned her head slightly toward Graham. "Warmcoat," she repeated faintly, a flicker of surprise softening into a fragile smile. "That's fitting." He cleared his throat, unsure what to do with the sudden warmth in the room. "You scared us," he said quietly. "But you're safe now." "I didn't mean to," she whispered. I didn't want her to see me like that. I was so tired." For a moment, no one spoke. The beeping of the monitor filled the silence. Then Graham said, "Rest, you can talk when you're stronger." But Mara's gaze lingered on him, curious, despite her exhaustion. "You look familiar," she murmured, brow furrowing slightly. "Have we met before?" He hesitated, caught between truth and something he couldn't name. "Maybe once," he said softly, "in passing." Back in the waiting room, the evening lights of Asheville flickered through the windows. Sophie sat beside him, tapping something on her phone. "Do you realize what today is?" she asked quietly. "December 1st, first day of the Winter Lights Festival downtown." Graham gave a faint smile. "I haven't gone in years." "You should," she said. "Take them when she's better. Might remind you what you've been missing." He didn't answer, but the thought lingered. When Mara finally fell asleep again, Lila refused to leave her side. A nurse brought a cot, and Graham stayed too, sitting in a corner chair as the night deepened. The sounds of the hospital faded into a distant hum. At some point, Lila's soft breathing joined the rhythm of the machine, steady and peaceful. Graham watched them both for a long time, something loosening inside him that had been locked away for years. He thought about the endless board meetings, the empty house, the painting of a frozen landscape hanging above his fireplace. None of it had meaning next to this two lives, fragile and real, depending on his presence. He didn't notice Sophie returning until she placed a folded blanket over his shoulders. "You did good today," she whispered. "Don't ruin it by pretending you don't care." He looked up, a tired half-smile crossing his face. "Since when do you read minds?" "Since the day I started working for you," she replied, then walked away quietly. He leaned back in the chair, eyes drifting to the hospital window. Snow was falling again, softer this time, each flake melting before it touched the glass. He thought about Lila's small voice calling him a warm coat, about Mara's faint smile, and the way the world outside suddenly felt less cold. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang slow and steady. Graham closed his eyes, letting the sound settle deep in his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man waiting for something to change. He felt like the change itself had already begun. Morning light filtered softly through the hospital blinds, turning the white room into shades of gold and pale blue. Outside, the snow had stopped leaving the streets, wrapped in a calm silence that only comes after a storm. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and hot chocolate. Lila sat on the edge of her mother's bed, drawing on a piece of paper with a small pack of crayons the nurse had brought her. Each color was bright, deliberate red for hearts, yellow for the sun, and green for the little house she'd seen through the car window. Graham stood by the door, watching quietly. He'd been there most of the night, leaving only once to grab coffee that went untouched. When Mara stirred awake, her eyes fluttered open slowly, adjusting to the morning light. She blinked in confusion before her gaze found her daughter and softened instantly. "You stayed," she whispered. Lila looked up, smiling wide. "Of course I did." "Mr. Warmcoat said I could." The nickname brought a faint color to Mara's cheeks. She turned to him, her voice still weak but kind. "I should thank you for everything." "You didn't have to do all this." Graham shook his head. "I did what anyone should have done." Her smile was faint but genuine. No, not everyone would have stopped. There was a quiet pause between them, the kind that felt both awkward and natural at the same time. He broke it by saying, "You work at Riverbend, right?" She nodded slowly. "Night shift, yes. I stitch linings for the winter coats." Her voice trailed off as she caught the irony in her own words. Winter coats. She gave a soft laugh that ended in a cough. "Guess I should have made one for myself." Graham looked down at the file Sophie had printed for him earlier that morning. "You've been working there for over 3 years," he said. "Never missed a shift, never took a sick day. Your supervisor didn't even notice you were gone." Mara's expression tightened. "That doesn't surprise me. We're not exactly seen. Just part of the machine, you know." He felt a quiet sting at her words. "That's my fault," he said, more to himself than to her. "I built that machine." Mara studied him for a long moment. "You own Ellison Textiles." It wasn't a question, it was realization. "I've seen your name on the paychecks." Graham nodded once, but there was no pride in his posture. "And yet I didn't recognize yours." The truth hung between them. Lila kept drawing, unaware of the gravity in her mother's tone. She hummed softly to herself, coloring in a bright blue sky. "Look, Mommy," she said, lifting the page. "That's us, and that's him." She pointed to a tall figure beside the 2 smaller ones. "He's got the big coat." Mara smiled tiredly. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." Then turning back to Graham, she added quietly, "She doesn't forget kindness." He met her gaze. "Neither should we." For a moment neither spoke. Outside, church bells began to chime, their sound echoing faintly through the cold air. Mara's eyes drifted toward the window. "I used to bring her downtown for the winter lights," she said softly. "We'd stand by the bridge and watch the lanterns float down the river. She'd tell me the stars were visiting early." Graham felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Nostalgia maybe, or regret mixed with wonder. "I haven't seen the lights since I was a kid," he admitted. "Didn't think I had the time." "You always have time," Mara said. "You just spend it on the wrong things." He didn't answer, but her words stayed with him. There was no accusation in them, only truth. A nurse entered quietly, checking Mara's chart and whispering something about discharge in a few days. Lila clapped her hands at the news. "That means we can go home," she said. But when she looked up at her mother, the excitement faded. "Wait, can we still go home?" Mara hesitated. Her rent had been overdue for weeks. The landlord had already left a final notice. She didn't have the heart to tell her daughter they didn't have a home to return to. Graham noticed her silence. "If you need help," he said carefully, "I can arrange something." Her eyes hardened a little, pride rising like a shield. "We'll manage, I'm sure you will," he replied softly, "but you don't have to do it alone." Mara looked away, tracing the edge of her blanket. People always say that right before they disappear. The remark hit deeper than she probably intended. He wanted to tell her he wouldn't disappear, that this was different, but even he wasn't sure why he was still here. He turned instead to the little drawing Lila had taped to the wall. It showed 3 figures standing under a glowing sun, their hands touching. The tallest one wore a brown coat. For some reason it felt more real than any painting he owned. Lila's voice broke the quiet. "Mommy, can we go see the lights again when you're better?" Mara smiled faintly. "If the weather lets us?" Graham spoke before he could stop himself. "I'll drive you both." Both mother and daughter looked at him surprised. Lila's smile grew immediately, but Mara hesitated. "You don't even know us," she said. "Maybe it's time I did." Outside, the clouds were parting just enough for sunlight to break through. It fell across the hospital floor, warm and clean, like a promise that something fragile was beginning to mend. The next evening arrived quiet and cold, the kind of winter night that made Asheville look like a painting. The snow from the storm had turned to a soft shimmer under the streetlights, and from the hospital window, Lila could see the faint glow of lanterns floating above the river in the distance. "Mommy, the stars are falling again," she said with excitement in her voice. Mara smiled from her bed. "That means the festival's starting." Sophie entered the room with a careful knock, carrying a bag of fresh clothes and a paper cup of soup. "Thought you might want something warm." "Ms. Collins," she said kindly, "Mr. Ellison's downstairs with the car." Mara blinked in surprise. "He's still here." Sophie smiled knowingly. "He doesn't leave things half done." When Graham came up moments later, he looked different, less like a man running a company, more like someone trying to learn how to belong again. He had a wool scarf draped over his shoulders and a quiet steadiness in his tone. "They said you could get some air," he said softly. "I thought maybe you'd like to see the lights even for a few minutes." Mara hesitated. "It's freezing." Lila tugged her sleeve. "Please, Mommy, just for a little." Mara sighed, but there was warmth in it. "All right," she said, "but only if I can stand." They left the hospital together, moving slowly under the soft whir of snow. The streets were alive with music now. Violins, laughter, the faint jingle of bells from food stalls lining the square. The Winter Lights Festival had always been the town's way of marking the start of hope after a long year. Couples strolled hand in hand. Children carried glowing balloons, and the scent of cinnamon and roasted pecans filled the air. Lila's eyes shone as she pointed at everything: the lanterns, the lights strung between trees, the giant Christmas tree near the fountain. "It's just like before," she whispered. Graham knelt beside her. "What did you wish for last time?" "A home that doesn't move," she said simply. He looked at her, then at Mara, who was standing a few steps behind her, face lit by golden reflections of light. They stopped near the bridge where the water mirrored the sky. Someone handed Lila a small paper lantern and a marker. "You get to write a wish," the volunteer said cheerfully. "Then you let it go." Lila turned to her mother. "Can I write one for us?" "Of course," Mara said. The girl crouched carefully on the bridge's railing, tongue poking out as she wrote in large, uneven letters. She looked up at Graham. "How do you spell family?" He smiled faintly. "Family. "Thank you." When she finished, she held the lantern between her palms and whispered something only she could hear. Then she set it gently on the water and watched it drift away. The glow reflected on her face, soft and full of quiet faith. Mara turned to Graham. "She hasn't smiled like that in months." He nodded, his voice low. "She reminds me what I forgot, that light still finds its way even in cold places." Mara studied him for a moment. "You speak like someone who's seen too much winter," maybe he said with a faint laugh. "But maybe this is the year it ends." They stood together in silence for a while, the sound of the river mixing with distant music. Around them, hundreds of lights floated downstream, each one carrying a wish, a prayer, or a memory. Lila slipped her hand into his coat pocket, her small fingers curling around his. "Yours is warm again," she said. He smiled down at her. "That's because you fixed it." Mara looked at them both, emotion flickering across her face, gratitude, disbelief. and something else she wasn't ready to name. "You didn't have to do this," she murmured. "You don't even know why we came to your gate." Graham turned to her. "Maybe I don't need to." But she shook her head. "You should know." She reached into her coat pocket and unfolded a wrinkled piece of paper. "This drawing, Lila's. She made it last winter after seeing your company's charity photo in the paper." She said, "That man looks lonely, Mommy. He needs someone to bring him home." Mara's voice wavered. "I didn't think much of it then, but last night when the power went out and the storm hit, she kept saying we had to find the big house on the hill. She said you were kind." Graham stared at the crayon drawing in her hand, the same one he had found in the backpack. His throat tightened. She believed that... "She did," Mara said softly. And somehow she was right. For a long moment none of them spoke. The river shimmered below, carrying their reflections along with the light. In the distance, church bells began to ring slow and steady. Lila looked up at the sky. "Mommy," she said, "I think the stars found us again." Graham exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the air. "Maybe they did," he whispered. They stayed by the river until the last lantern disappeared downstream. Then, Graham turned toward the car, holding out his hand to Mara. She hesitated before taking it, her grip unsure but real. Together they walked back through the glowing streets, Lila skipping ahead between them, her laughter echoing like small bells through the winter night. As they reached the car, Graham glanced once more toward the river, the light still flickering like memories refusing to fade. Something inside him shifted quietly like snow melting under the first touch of spring. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years he wanted to find out. 2 days after the festival, the snow began to melt. The streets of Asheville glistened under a pale sun, and thin trails of mist rose from the rooftops. It was the kind of morning that hinted at a new beginning, though no one dared say it aloud. Inside the hospital, Mara was getting dressed, moving slowly but with more strength than before. The doctor had cleared her to leave, and a nurse folded the last of the discharge papers into a brown envelope. Lila bounced on her toes, clutching her worn backpack. "Can we go home now, Mommy?" she asked. Mara's smile faltered. "We will soon, sweetheart." But she didn't know where home was anymore. The apartment had been a month overdue, and even if the landlord hadn't changed the locks yet, she doubted they'd be welcome back. When the door opened, Graham stood there, framed by soft morning light. He wasn't wearing his usual polished expression. There was something gentler, almost uncertain about him. "Good morning," he said. "You look stronger." Mara smiled faintly. "Still standing, at least." "That's a start," he replied. Lila ran up to him. "Mr. Warmcoat, we're going home." He knelt to her height, his tone kind. "That's wonderful, Lila, but your mom needs a few days to rest. How would you feel about staying somewhere warm until she's ready?" "Like a hotel?" she asked, eyes wide. "Better," he said with a small smile. "A place with a big kitchen, hot cocoa, and a garden covered in snow." Mara's brows lifted. "You're not suggesting—" "Just a few days," he interrupted gently. "You'll have your own rooms. Mrs. Ames will help with meals. And I promise there are no strings attached." She hesitated, torn between pride and exhaustion. Then she saw Lila's hopeful eyes, and her resistance melted. "Only until I'm back on my feet," she said quietly. "Deal?" Graham replied, and somehow it felt like more than an agreement. The ride to the Ellison estate was quiet. Lila pressed her face against the window, watching the trees slide past like tall green sentinels dusted with snow. When the car turned onto the long driveway, she gasped. The house rose before them, its tall windows reflecting the pale sun wreaths still hanging on the doors. "It's like a castle," she whispered. Graham smiled. A drafty one, but yes. Inside, warmth greeted them immediately. The scent of cinnamon lingered from the kitchen, and a golden fire burned low in the living room. Mrs. Ames, a kind woman with silver hair pulled into a bun, stepped forward to welcome them. "You must be Mara," she said warmly, "and this little angel must be Lila. Come in, take off those coats. I've got hot cocoa on the stove." Lila's eyes lit up. "Mommy, can I have marshmallows? All you want, sweetheart." Mrs. Ames laughed. Mara murmured a thank you and followed her daughter inside. She paused by the entryway, looking around at the high ceilings, the soft rugs, the light streaming through tall windows. Everything seemed untouched by the kind of struggle she knew too well. Graham noticed the way her shoulders tensed. "It's just a house," he said quietly, sensing her unease. "Without people in it, it's nothing." She looked at him, surprised by the honesty in his voice. "You say that like you know." "I do," he said simply. Later that afternoon, Lila explored every corner of the house, touching the grand piano, peeking behind curtains, giggling at the echo of her own footsteps in the hall. Mara helped Mrs. Ames in the kitchen, her movements still cautious but steady. Graham watched from the doorway as she stirred soup on the stove, sleeves rolled to her elbow, strands of blonde hair falling loose. There was something grounding about seeing her there, real human, alive, turning a cold house into a home without even realizing it. When dinner was ready, they ate together at the long oak table that hadn't been used in years. Conversation came easily, mostly because of Lila, who talked about her favorite colors, how she wanted a puppy, and how she thought snowflakes were tiny frozen wishes. Mara listened, smiling, while Graham found himself laughing more than he had in a decade. It wasn't loud or forced, it was quiet, genuine, the kind that sneaks up and stays. After dinner, Lila fell asleep on the couch, curled under a blanket near the fire. The room glowed with the kind of warmth that wasn't just from the flames. Mara turned to Graham. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "You already have," he replied. "You reminded me what this place was supposed to be." She glanced at him, unsure how to answer. "I didn't do much." "You brought light," he said, his voice low, "and I'd forgotten what that looked like." The words hung in the air, tender and unguarded. She looked down, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You make it sound easy," she murmured. "It isn't," he said, almost a whisper. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow began again, slow, steady, patient. Inside, for the first time in years, the Ellison estate felt alive. And somewhere deep down, both of them knew this was the start of something neither had planned for, but both had needed. That night, the house was quiet, except for the soft hum of wind against the windows. Graham walked down the long hallway, each step echoing faintly through the empty rooms. He stopped by the doorway to his late father's study. The room smelled of dust and cedar, untouched since the funeral. Old portraits lined the walls, faces stern and proud men who had built an empire but forgotten how to live. He stared at the largest one, the same man whose shadow had followed him his entire life. "You'd hate this," he murmured. "People in your house, noise, laughter." His voice cracked slightly. But maybe that's what it needed all along. He turned off the light and walked toward the living room. From the doorway, he saw Mara asleep on the sofa, Lila curled beside her. The firelight danced across their faces, softening every line, every scar. The old house, once cold and hollow, now breathed again. Graham stood there for a long time, the warmth from the hearth spilling toward him. He didn't step closer, afraid the moment would vanish if he moved. Instead, he whispered to the quiet air, "Thank you for walking to my door." Outside, snowflakes drifted down once more, gentle and slow. And for the first time since his father's death, Graham Ellison closed his eyes and felt at peace in his own home. By Monday morning, word had already spread through Ellison Textiles. Something had changed. The usual clipped memos and strict schedules were replaced with new notices, shorter shifts, longer breaks, emergency health funds. Some thought it was a mistake. Others whispered that the boss had finally gone soft. Graham arrived at headquarters before sunrise, the air still crisp with snow. Sophie was already waiting with a stack of papers and a look that mixed confusion with admiration. "You're rewriting the entire system," she said. "Overnight." He shrugged lightly. It needed rewriting. In the boardroom, the executives stared at him as though he'd lost his mind. 10-hour maximum shifts. Paid child care. "We'll lose margins," one argued. Graham's voice stayed calm. "We've already lost people. I'm just making sure it doesn't happen again." That afternoon, he walked the factory floor himself, something he hadn't done in years. The workers froze when they saw him, unsure whether to greet or hide. But when he stopped to help a man lift a box, or when he smiled and said, "Take a break. It's been a long morning," something in the air softened. Back at the estate, Mara was sitting by the window with a cup of tea, sunlight touching her hair. Lila played on the rug building towers out of wooden blocks. When Graham walked in, the room filled with the faint chill of winter air and warmth that had nothing to do with fire. Mara looked up, surprised to see the weariness in his eyes. "Long day." He smiled faintly. "A good one." Lila ran to him, holding up a drawing. "Look, it's your building. But I made it happier. He knelt, laughing softly. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. For a moment, all three of them stood in the golden afternoon light, quiet, simple, and real. It wasn't triumph or forgiveness or love yet, but it was the start of all three. The next day, the boardroom was full. Suits, polished shoes, the faint buzz of tension. Graham stood at the head of the table. Sleeves rolled up, eyes calm. The executives spoke in turns. Profit charts, losses, projections. Every word was a warning. But when it was his turn, he didn't raise his voice. I built this company to make things, he said quietly. But somewhere along the way, we stopped making them for people. A little girl nearly froze to death because her mother was too afraid to take a sick day. That's not efficiency. That's failure. The room went silent. Someone cleared his throat. With respect, Mr. Ellison, compassion doesn't pay dividends. Graham smiled faintly. Maybe not in dollars, but I've seen what the absence of it costs. He ended the meeting early, leaving his notes untouched. Outside, the winter light was sharp and clean. He stood for a moment, watching his reflection in the glass wall. Same face, same man, but something behind the eyes had changed. That evening he came home to laughter. Lila was baking with Mrs. Ames, her face dusted with flour. Mara was arranging flowers on the kitchen counter. Smells like sugar in here, he said, setting down his briefcase. Lila grinned. We made cookies. Want one? He took one, still warm, and looked around at the soft glow of the house, the hum of life that had returned. This, he said under his breath, is what matters. Mara glanced at him, her expression gentle. Maybe the world's finally catching up to you, Mr. Warmcoat. He chuckled. Let's hope so. Outside, the snow fell again, thin and slow, like quiet applause for a man who had finally learned what it meant to build something worth keeping. By late January, the mountains around Asheville had turned white again. The cold came back harder this time, with wind that moaned through the trees like an old song. Inside the Ellison estate, the fire burned steady, the rooms alive with a warmth that hadn't existed months before. Lila's laughter carried from the hallway as she chased Mrs. Ames's cat while Mara folded laundry by the window, humming softly. Graham stood in the doorway, just watching. There was peace here, fragile, unspoken, but real. Yet even as he smiled, a shadow crossed his mind. The quarterly numbers had come in that morning, and the board wasn't pleased. The reforms, the shorter hours, health funds, childcare had slowed production. Sophie had warned him they'll call an emergency meeting. That night after dinner, he found Mara sitting by the fire. She looked up when he entered. You've been quiet all evening, she said gently. Just thinking, he replied. About what happens when people don't agree with change. Mara smiled faintly. Then you keep doing it anyway. Change doesn't need permission. Her words landed heavier than she knew. Graham looked at her, realizing how much her quiet strength had reshaped him. He sat beside her. You make it sound easy. It isn't, she said. But it's worth it. The next morning, the storm arrived, thick snow, sharp wind power lines sagging under the weight of ice. The company line buzzed with chaos, shipments delayed, employees stranded, systems failing. Sophie called 3 times in an hour. We need you downtown, Graham. Investors are panicking. He looked at Lila, who was building a fort out of couch pillows, her cheeks pink from the heat of the fireplace. Not today, he said quietly. Not until I know they're safe. By noon, the power flickered once, twice, then went out. The house dimmed into soft gray. Lila gasped, clutching her bear. Is it like the big storm again? Mara glanced at Graham, worry in her eyes. We'll be fine, he said, lighting a lantern. This time we're not alone. The wind howled outside, rattling the old windows. Inside, the small circle of light from the lantern fell on their faces, 3 figures huddled together, the glow warm against the dark. And as the storm pressed against the glass, Graham realized something simple and profound. The difference between loneliness and family wasn't the size of the house, it was who waited out the storm with you. By dawn, the storm had eased, leaving the world buried under a thick white silence. The power was still out, but the sky glowed faintly pink beyond the hills. Graham stepped outside, his boots sinking deep into the snow. The air was sharp and clean, each breath biting but alive. From somewhere down the road came the faint sound of an engine trying and failing to start. Mara appeared at the door, wrapped in a blanket. Is someone out there? He nodded. Neighbor's truck. Must have stalled in the cold. Without another word, he pulled on his coat and gloves. Lila called after him, "Be careful, Mr. Warmcoat." He smiled over his shoulder. "That's what the coat's for." The truck belonged to an elderly couple who lived a few houses away. Their porch light was out, their hands trembling from the cold. Graham didn't hesitate. He shoveled snow from their driveway, jump-started the battery, and carried firewood inside. The old man tried to thank him, but Graham just shook his head. "You'd do the same for me." When he returned home, his face was red from the wind, his scarf frosted with snow. Mara met him at the door, a steaming mug in her hand. "You didn't have to go," she said softly. "Yes, I did," he answered. "That's what neighbors are for." Lila came running with her drawing pad. On the page, she'd sketched 3 stick figures beside a big house with smoke rising from the chimney. "That's us," she said proudly. "We kept the light on." Graham crouched beside her, voice quiet. "Even when the power's out, huh?" "Yep," she said, beaming. "Because we have each other." He looked at Mara, and she smiled in that slow, knowing way of hers. The house behind them glowed faintly from the lantern's light, the storm finally fading. And as snow began to fall again, soft and harmless, this time Graham realized that the warmth he'd been searching for wasn't something to build. It was something to share. The last snow of February fell quietly over Asheville, blanketing rooftops and muffling every sound. The town was slower now, calmer, like winter itself was exhaling. At the Ellison estate, the fire glowed low, the house filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine. Mara stood by the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, watching the soft flakes drift down. Behind her, Lila sat at the table cutting paper hearts and taping them to the window pane. "It looks prettier now," she said proudly. "It does." Mara smiled. "You've turned the storm into something kind." When Graham came in from outside, his coat dusted with snow, he paused for a moment at the doorway. The sight of them, the soft light, the laughter, the smell of something baking hit him like déjà vu from a life he'd never lived but always wanted. "You two are turning this place into an art gallery," he said lightly. "More like a Valentine's museum," Mara replied. He chuckled, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Fitting," he said. "You know, today marks exactly 1 month since you both walked through my gate." Mara blinked. "Only a month," she said softly. "It feels like a lifetime ago." They sat down together for breakfast, toast jam and hot cocoa, simple but perfect. Lila hummed as she ate, her braid bouncing with each sip. "Mommy," she said, "are we going to stay here forever?" Mara froze, glancing at Graham. "Sweetheart, we can't," but before she could finish, he spoke quietly. "She's asking the right question." He said, his eyes warm but serious. After breakfast, he asked Mara to take a walk. The air outside was crisp sunlight, glinting off the snow like scattered diamonds. They followed the garden path behind the house where frost sparkled on bare branches. "When I first built this place," Graham said, "I thought space and silence were signs of success. But they're just walls without meaning. You and Lila, you changed that." Mara stopped, turning to him. "We didn't do anything special," she said. "We just needed somewhere to breathe. That's exactly what you did," he said gently. "You taught me how to breathe again." She looked away, unsure how to reply. "You've done enough for us," she said after a moment. "We can't stay forever. People will talk." "Let them," he said simply. "I've spent years listening to people who said the wrong things. Maybe it's time to listen to my heart instead." The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. Mara's eyes softened. "You really mean that?" He nodded. "I do." They stood in silence for a long while, the only sound the crunch of snow under their boots. When they returned to the house, Lila was waiting by the fireplace, holding something behind her back. "Close your eyes," she said, giggling. Graham did. "Okay," she whispered, now open. In her hands was a small paper card, unevenly cut and decorated with red crayon hearts. On the front it read, "Our Home." Inside, written in her round, wobbly letters, were just 3 words. "Stay with us." Graham looked up, his throat tight. "Did you make this?" "Uh-huh," Lila said, "because homes need families, and you don't have one." Mara's eyes widened. "Lila." But Graham smiled softly, kneeling so his eyes were level with the little girl's. "You're right," he said. "I don't. Not yet." He turned the card over in his hands, the crayon marks smudged but full of care. Do you know, he said gently, this is the first time someone ever asked me to stay? Lila grinned, missing the gravity in his tone. Then you should say yes. Mara looked at them both, her heart full and trembling. There was something in the air. Something larger than gratitude, quieter than love, but just as powerful. A warmth that felt permanent, as if the house itself was listening and smiling. Graham stood, slipping the little paper into his coat pocket. Maybe I already did, he said softly. The rest of the day passed slowly, filled with small, perfect ordinariness. Cookies cooling on the counter, Lila singing to herself in the hallway, the house alive with gentle noise. As night fell, the snow outside stopped and moonlight streamed across the living room floor. From his office upstairs, Graham looked out over the hills, thinking of all the years he had spent in silence. Below, the laughter of two voices carried faintly through the halls, warm and perfect human. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a man standing apart from the world. He felt like part of it, and as he closed the office light, he whispered a promise only the quiet could hear. This time I'll stay. The night came softly, draping the mountains in silver. Inside the Ellison estate, the air was filled with music from the old record player, something slow and warm, the kind of song people used to dance to when the world was simpler. Lila had fallen asleep on the couch again, her small hand clutching her stuffed bear, the firelight flickering across her cheeks. Mara tucked a blanket around her daughter, then turned to find Graham standing by the window holding 2 mugs of tea. She never makes it to the end of the song, he said with a gentle smile. She gets that from me, Mara replied, laughing softly. We've both had too many long nights. He handed her the tea and looked toward the snow falling outside. It's the last storm of the season, he said. By morning the sky will be clear again. Mara sipped her tea, her gaze following his. Funny, she said. A month ago I hated the snow. Now it feels like it brought us here. He nodded slowly. It did. There was a pause, a quiet, deep one that carried everything words couldn't. Then he took something from his pocket, a small white envelope with her name written in his careful handwriting. This was supposed to wait until tomorrow, he said, but I think tonight feels right. Mara hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside was a folded note and a tiny silver ring tied to a red thread. The note read simply, "Some storms bring loss, others bring home." She looked up, tears forming before she could stop them. Graham. He stepped closer, voice steady but soft. When you and Lila walked into my life, I thought I was saving someone. But it was you who saved me. You gave this house laughter, and you gave me something to live for again. Mara's breath caught. Are you sure this is what you want? You've built a world, he shook his head gently. All I ever built were walls. You tore them down without even trying. He lowered himself to one knee, the glow of the fire catching in his eyes. I don't want to fix your life, Mara. I just want to be in it. Will you both of you let me come home every day for the rest of my life? For a heartbeat, the world went silent. Then Mara covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. Yes, she whispered the word, trembling with relief. Yes, we will. Graham smiled, a quiet kind of joy spreading across his face. Lila stirred on the couch, blinking sleepily. Mommy, she murmured. What's happening? Mara knelt beside her daughter, brushing her hair back. Mr. Warmcoat asked if he could stay with us forever. Lila grinned drowsily. Did you say yes? Mara laughed through her tears. I did. Good, Lila said, already half asleep again. Then we're not lost anymore. The fire popped softly and Graham reached for Mara's hand. They sat together in silence, the three of them framed by the glow of the hearth. Outside, the snow had stopped. The world was still calm, listening. Later that night, when the moon rose high over the mountains, its light spilled through the window and onto the floor, stretching all the way to where Lila slept. Graham looked at it and smiled. Funny thing about light, he said quietly. Even when it fades, it always finds a way back. Mara rested her head on his shoulder. Maybe that's because it knows where it belongs. He nodded, his fingers brushing the edge of the ring now on her hand. Then let's make sure it stays. And there, in the soft hum of the fire and the quiet peace of a winter night, the man who once lived alone in a house of silence finally found what he'd been missing all along. Not wealth, not power, but a family. The kind of warmth that stays long after the storm is gone. The snow had long melted, but the light that filled Graham's home never faded. What began as a rescue in the cold became a quiet rebirth, a man rediscovering warmth through two souls who simply needed a place to belong. In their laughter and shared silence, he found what wealth could never give: peace. And maybe that's how love works. It doesn't arrive with grand gestures, only small acts of care that grow roots and stay. Sometimes redemption begins with something as simple as opening a door. Like the porch light that never goes out on a winter night, kindness steady unspoken can guide us home when we've lost our way. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever opened your door to someone who needed warmth? If this story moved you, press 1 in the comments. If you think it could be better, press 0 and share your thoughts. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stay with us. A little kindness goes a long way.